Hello and welcome to this first in this Understanding End Time series. Back in a minute. Okay, again, welcome, and a couple of things I want to do to start off this first in this series. Maybe lay down some ground rules. For one thing, if you hear the air conditioner running, don't worry about it. It's hotter than blue blazes on this North Texas day in July. I think the feel like temperature is supposed to be about 110 degrees out today, and so the air conditioner just buzzing away. And anyway, try to keep it as cool as we can here. Another thing is just lay down some ground rules. For one thing, I have on numerous occasions gotten on YouTube or primarily YouTube, other Vimeo, and not so much Rumble because it's fairly new. But there'll be a teaching on there that'll be an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes. And I enjoy listening to good teaching, but I'm not going to sit in front of a computer that long and watch it. And so I'm not going to put you through that. What I want to do with these discussions is to lay a basic groundwork for a point of prophecy where you as an individual can get just enough so that you can file it away and say, well, that's nice. I'll look for the rapture, or I'm ready for the rapture, or I don't believe the rapture, or whatever the case may be, and then just leave it alone and go somewhere else. I'm going to keep these about 30 to 35 minutes long. Another thing is I want to provide some study guides for you, and I'll show you 3 books in just a minute, and there'll be a 4th one that we discuss later, this one that I wrote, that really it does give you some good information on the rapture, but it's primarily designed to help a person that misses the rapture find out what to do. What do I do now that these millions and millions and millions and millions of people have suddenly vanished? Now, when we get to probably next week, I want to cover some things. It may go into the week after that. Some things that I believe signal the results of the rapture, and that's a worldwide destruction. It looks like it's been demolition of the planet that we don't see sometime. We see it in one of the opening of one of the 6 seals in the book of Revelation, and we'll talk about that. And some of these things, we have to be very careful setting dates, saying this is absolute. There's one absolute that you can put your entire future on, and that is salvation is by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. Romans 10, if you believe in your heart that God raised Jesus from the dead, confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, you got your ticket punched. You're going to go to heaven when you die because you've been born again. Those are absolute things. As far as all of the profile, the little ins and outs of the taking place of the rapture, when the rapture takes place, when the Antichrist is revealed, when the Ezekiel 38 and 39 war takes place, there are a lot of different opinions by very credible scholars. So I want to present those as a just suppose. Just suppose it's this way. How will it change your life? What will you do in your life to adjust and to make yourself comfortable with this event, no matter what happens, okay? All right, with that done, let me present you some books that I have pulled a great deal of information from. I'll do it on the share screen here on this Zoom dealie here. There we go. And so here's one. This is The Coming Prince. That was written by Sir Robert Anderson. Now, Sir Robert Anderson is a very fascinating character. He was a lead instructor at Scotland Yard on some of the greatest murder mysteries, trying to find the murderer and so forth. And he turned his investigative skills to primarily, or to Bible prophecy, but primarily the prophecy in the book of Daniel. And so he came up with some fascinating information that I think you would find very interesting. You can get this book, as with all of them, either as a Kindle book off of Amazon.com or as a paperback, and they'll get it to you in just a few days. Now, another book that I've drawn a lot of interest from is Earthquake Resurrection, written by David W. Lowe. Same way, you can get it on Amazon.com. He presents some very interesting, deeper views of what happens with the rapture of the church. Now, you can see kind of what he's talking about or where he's going by the title of the book, Earthquake Resurrection. And he's got a sequel to that that's come out. Well, it's been out for some time, but it takes this concept even a little bit deeper. You would enjoy reading that. It's a verse-by-verse study of the book of Revelation, and particularly with the event of the rapture taking place within that, okay? Dispels a lot of false teaching. Listen, there is so much false teaching. I've done it. I look back in 30 years, 35 years, when I taught the book of Revelation. Let me just say that it seems like that the knowledge concerning what happens at the end times has increased. Maybe that's what the Archangel Gabriel was referring to when he gave a prediction to David. David said, what do I do with this particular? He'd already given the 70 weeks of years prediction. This is post. What do I do with this? And he said, seal it up until the end times. And then he gives two qualifying events or conditions that would signal the opening of this additional prophecy or these additional predictions. One of them was that knowledge would be greatly increased. And I think he may have been talking not just about the knowledge that we find in our technology that's increased, medical knowledge and so forth, but knowledge about the end time things of God would increase. Other things would be opened up to us so that we would understand them better. The other was that people would be running to and fro, and you can take that just as far as you want to take it, because we know that's true. All right, and then the last book is one that I've drawn a lot of information from, by Dr. Chuck Missler. He passed away some years ago. He was a fabulous Bible teacher, especially on end-time prophecy, and he's got a book that is dedicated totally to Daniel's 70 weeks. So some of the information I'm going to present to you today comes from this book. So I think you could look at those books and go a long way towards a deeper understanding of what we're talking about. Now then, let me lay the groundwork for, because we're going to be talking about the prophecy that was given to Daniel. And this prophecy actually took place about 600 years before the birth of Christ is when the prophecy took place. There's some time difference in that, but it was some years after Israel had been taken captive into Babylon. Now, why did God allow the nation of Israel and the city of Jerusalem to be totally decimated, and his people, Israel, to be taken into captivity to a pagan culture like Babylon? There are a number of reasons. It seems like down through history, and this is another study altogether, as to why all of the nations of the world, as described in the Old Testament, were against Israel. It seemed like that just constantly two things were happening. One, they were against Israel and wanted to destroy it. The second thing was that the people of Israel kept on screwing up and starting to worship fallen gods. The small g gods, the B'nai Elohim. These were not imaginary creatures. They were real creatures that were fallen. Now, the term angel, let me just kind of lay that to rest. The term angel is a job description. Gabriel is an angel. Michael is not an angel. Gabriel is the head of God's communication department. That's what the term angel means. Michael is a warrior. He's the head of God's angelic army, and he's also the supreme protector of the nation of Israel. And so he is not an angel because he doesn't normally carry messages around. Gabriel brought multiple messages. We see him all through the Bible. And we also see his lieutenants, if you want to call them that, his communication squad, whatever you want to call them. And I think it gets on down to the lower echelon of these divine communication or message bearers that maybe even you and I have gotten direction from one of these beings and we didn't even know it. And so at any rate, the Bible says be careful lest you entertain angels. This is messengers. Lest you entertain messages and not be aware of it, or messengers. And so that's the thing behind that. Now, Israel had disobeyed one of God's prime directives. That was that every 7 years, it's called a Shemitah year, and on the 7th year, the land was to lay dormant. It was to have a time to recover from the cultivation and so forth that it had gone through for the previous 6 years. Israel didn't do that. And so in the final analysis, without getting too deep in the weeds, God was owed 70 years for the disobedience, the times that the land was overused and overworked. And so for that reason, they had Israel had been taken captive. God had given Babylon the ability to go in and take Israel captive. Now there was a young teenage boy, probably about 14 years old or so, by the name of Daniel, that was taken captive. And during his time in Babylon, he had a very unique skill. Here I think it was probably the working of the messengers again. He had a very unique skill to interpret dreams and visions and so forth. And he had done that for a number of times for various high-level leaders, primarily the premier or the king or whatever. It had allowed him to be moved up the chain of command until at one point he even became prime minister. And so when we pick up the story that we're talking about, he's in his 80s. He has been reading the writings of the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah had stated in his writings that God was going to release Israel or set them free after 70 years. That would mean the debt had been paid after 70 years in captivity. So Daniel, being a leader among his people, begins to petition God as to what should happen, what was he going to do with the nation of Israel. And for 21 days he fasted and prayed. Now, on the first day, the messenger Gabriel was dispatched from heaven to take God. God had given Gabriel the message to bring to Daniel, and he had started this direction. And you have to remember that, here's another study, but there are high-ranking small g gods, B'nai Elohim. These are fallen entities that have been placed in command over every nation, every city, every village, and so forth. The most powerful ones are placed over large cities and in our case states and so forth. And so as Gabriel was on his way, he encountered one of these entities that did not want him to carry this message to David, and so they got into a fight. And the fight lasted for several days. If you can imagine that, in the spiritual world, on the other side, the unseen realm, this tremendous battle going on between these gigantic creatures. And finally, Michael, I guess, gets turned loose from some of his other duties, and he goes there to relieve Gabriel, to take over the battle, so that Gabriel can come on and bring that message to Daniel, which he does. And so when he gets there, when Gabriel gets there, he gives Daniel a number of things, but in just, I think, 4 short verses, he lays out a 490-year prophecy and during that time, during that 490 years, God will be dealing exclusively with the nation of Israel. It would have nothing to do with the Gentiles and the other folks around the world. It would only have to do with the nation of Israel. So let's look at those scriptures briefly, and I can bring it up here, right? Another thing real quickly, if you have any questions you want to ask or any discussion, or if you disagree or have an alternative view, let me invite you to send me an email. Let me pull this email up while I'm thinking about it here. Yeah, there it is. Okay, there's the email you can send, understandingendtimes2022@gmail.com. Understanding End Times 2022@gmail.com. You can go there and I will, if at all possible, answer your email. Now, let's look at this first 69 weeks. This prophecy is broken up into two parts. There are 69 weeks. Without getting into all the description, if you want to get into these books and learn how the math works and how these words work in the Bible so that we come up with the 490 years as being the 70 weeks of years, then you can do that. It's kind of complex, and I'm not going to get into that because it would take another 45 minutes just to do that. But it's broken up into 69 weeks. The 69 weeks is 483 years of the 490 years that make up the total prophecy. There are still 7 years left to be fulfilled. We're going to talk about that next week. That is basically the tribulation period. So here's the first one in Daniel verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem. All right, now that's one part. That's the beginning of this 490-year time period. It will begin actually the 483 years, and then there will be an interval that we're still in today. That interval will last at least 2,000 years. All right, but this first part of it, the prophecy itself, would begin when the commandment. Now remember, Israel is in captivity. They're about to be turned loose. They want to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the city. Not just the temple. They're asking, the prophecy deals with laying the bricks for the wall of Jerusalem. And then it says when that starts, and we find in the book of Nehemiah the exact date that the king of Babylon gave the permission, wrote it down, gave the permission to the Jewish leaders to leave and go back to Jerusalem. And they said this prophecy, this is what makes this such a fascinating prophecy, this prophecy would begin on the moment, at the second that the first brick was laid down to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. And that's what he's saying. From the going forth of the commandments to restore and build Jerusalem. Now, the next phase is, it marks the ending point for this part of the prophecy. Until Messiah, the Prince, we'll get to what all that means, shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and the streets shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. This is saying, in just our everyday understanding, this prophecy begins, the first of it, begins when the first brick is laid to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. It ends at some point in the future, exactly 483 years to the day after this first brick is laid. And on that day, there would be an event take place that would recognize the Messiah being cut off. The Messiah being recognized and then being cut off. All right. And then it kind of explains it a little bit here. This includes a mathematical prophecy, as we have noted in previous articles, which we didn't get to those, but the Jewish Babylonian calendar, and this is important. There is what's called a creation calendar, and it has 360 days, consists of 12 months of 30 days each. That is the calendar that's used for all Bible prophecy. People try to use our 365-degree calendar, and they come up with all kinds of weird conclusions on these prophecies. It's because they're using the wrong calendar. So when Daniel, the calendar Daniel used was this 360-degree calendar that we're talking about here. Now, it used a 360-degree calendar. 69 weeks of 360-day years totals 173,880 days. In effect, Gabriel told Daniel that the interval between the commandment to rebuild Jerusalem until the presentation of the Messiah as king would be 173,880 days. Hang on to that thought. We'll be back in just a minute after this break. enjoyed that. Hope you'll take advantage of it. All right, this is to recap briefly the first period of this 490-degree prophecy is going to be 83 or 483 years, and using here again to recap the 360-day calendar, 173,880 days, and that's what we have here. Now, Messiah the Prince in the King James Version translation, which I don't use the King James very much, and I don't want to get anybody's dander up, but there are a lot of filters in the English that was used to translate the King James Version. Now, the King James in its presentation of rebirth is perfect. Salvation by grace through faith, not of works, lest any man should boast. But some of the Old Testament prophecies and so forth, they get a little bit confusing, and you literally have to get into an older translation than what was used to translate the King James Version to come up with some of the deals that we have there. Now, all right, so it's Messiah the King is what they're referring to. Okay, and we call that a bullseye. The commandment to rescue and build Jerusalem was given by Artaxerxes Longimanus, hard to pronounce, on March the 14th, 445 BC. That's when the king of Babylon gave a letter to some of the Israeli people, Jeremiah and some of them, to return to where Jerusalem had been standing and had been pretty well destroyed, and start the process of rebuilding the walls and the streets and so forth, not the temple at this point in time, but to rebuild the city. Now, there are, and what are we talking about the time it ends? The ministry of Jesus, there are several occasions which the people attempted to promote Jesus to king, and he avoided it. The statement was, "My hour is not yet come." But there's an event that took place that brings this prophecy, the ending of this portion of this prophecy, into focus. Then one day he meticulously arranged it. On this particular day, he rode into the city of Jerusalem riding on a donkey, deliberately fulfilling a prophecy by Zechariah that the Messiah would present himself as king in exactly that way. Riding on a donkey and entering into Jerusalem, the people proclaimed him as king, and he accepted it because he says, when the Sanhedrin came out there and tried to stop the people from proclaiming Jesus as Messiah, he told them for the first time, a statement like this, he said, "If these people stop praising me, then the rocks will cry out." Jesus presented himself as the Messiah, and they turned him down. Now, whenever we might easily miss the significance of what's going on, this is what I just said, is what I wrote here. The Pharisees come to our rescue, and this is what I just quoted. Now, this is the only occasion in the life of Jesus on the earth where he presented himself as king. And listen, it occurred on April the 6th, 32 AD. Now, look at the precision of this prophecy. When we examine the period between March the 14th, 445 BC, that's the day that the first brick was laid for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. The prophecy says that this time period, this first part of this 490 years would take place. The clock would start. God's clock would start at that moment. That was March the 14th, 445 BC. It continued to run through time for 483 years as God dealt with the nation of Israel. And then it would halt suddenly on April the 6th, 32 AD. Now, correcting for leap years and operating on the 460 or 360 degree calendar, we count those days 173,880 days, and it comes up to April the 6th, 32 AD. You cannot get any more exact than that. In fact, some people, some of the early church fathers looking back on this, said Daniel could not have written this because there's no prophecy that can be this exact, beginning on a certain day, running its course, ending at exactly the day when it said it would end. However, Jesus ratified Daniel. He talked about something called I forgot the term. Anyway, when the Antichrist would go into the temple and desecrate the temple, and he said, he made a statement saying that, I don't think I put it down here, but another part of let me go ahead with this and then we'll finish it up. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, not for himself, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And what's he saying here in modern English? He's saying that Messiah would be cut off on this particular day. The result of Israel, God expected the leaders of Israel to understand the prophecy given in Daniel. They may have understood it, but they must have been all Democrats, because they were so much in power, they would cover the truth in order to maintain their control over the people. And so they stopped it. Now, because of that, Jesus forecasted, and we see the fulfillment of that forecast in 70 AD, 70 years after the death of, or the birth of Jesus, some 30 some odd years after he made that prophecy. The Roman commander Titus came into Jerusalem and totally destroyed it. He killed millions, took millions into slavery, and it was because the people of Israel refused to go ahead with the acceptance of Jesus as Messiah. Now, let me make this statement emphatically. God knew that this was going to happen. He didn't forecast, he didn't cause it to happen, he didn't predestine it to happen, but he knew it was going to happen, and so he provided the results so that the nations of Gentiles would have the opportunity to be saved. There was a temporary blindness put on the nation of Israel so that you and I, as Gentiles, could have the awesome privilege of being grafted into God's family. And as we go ahead, you'll see there are three different entities that are talked about in the Bible, and it is Jews, Gentiles, and the church, and they're separate entities: Jews, Gentiles, and the church, because the church includes Jews and Gentiles. That's the body of Christ, or the bride of Christ, and we'll talk more about that in the next few weeks coming up. I think that's probably enough for today. You understand how absolute this prophecy is. It started at the moment that it was supposed to start. It ended at the very moment that it was prophesied to end. Since that time, God's clock has not been running. This is what's called the time of the Gentiles. From the time that Jesus, on that day, 4 days later, was crucified and then buried and resurrected and so forth. That's another story. And when will this clock start back? When will God's clock to finish up this 490-degree prophecy start back? Well, we'll cover that next week. Until then, be blessed.